Hi, it's Corey Glenn, and in this video we're going to keep it really simple today. I think I made a video of this a long time ago, but had some recent questions from some people just starting out in printing. So the question is just very basic. How do I take my intraoral scans and then print those models, right? So when you take an intraoral scan with whatever intraoral scanner you have, right, you're going to end up with a model that looks like this. Okay, so you're going to get as much of the gingiva and as the teeth and the vestibule as you include in your scan. However, this model currently is still not 3D printable, right? Because right now this is not actually a three-dimensional object. It is just a one-dimensional mesh, right? There's no thickness to this. Uh, you know, there's no three-dimensionality to this until we actually put a base on it and turn this into what I'll call a water-type model. So let's just go through very quickly how to do that. So the first thing you'll want to do is just open this in some CAD program, right? So I'm using Mesh Mixer. I think this is a good option because it's free, it's accessible, it's relatively easy to use, especially for something real basic like this. And the first thing you're going to want to do is just look at your borders, right? So you're going to want to get smooth borders. Sometimes when you have an intraoral scan, you'll get little jagged borders or areas of overlapping mesh. And if you've got that, you might either want to, focus on that more during your scan and ensure that you're not including that as part of your scan. That's the easiest solution. Or if you only notice it after the fact, I would just say cut that out. So for example, we don't have a fold in the mesh or anything right here, but let's just pretend that we did. So what I could do is just open this STL file in Mesh Mixer and then take this select tool and just lasso whatever that area is that I needed to fix or get rid of, okay? So there you see we've done that. We could pick up any little missed triangles, or you know, conversely, sometimes you'll have this scenario where, let's say there's just like one area, like a big crack that you've missed, and you wanted to close that. You don't necessarily want to go in and cut out all this data, right? So sometimes you actually have to repair a model, in which case, like right here, we could just select both boundaries. Oops, let's clear that. We could just select this boundary and push Control B, or if you come up here you'll see bridge, okay? And now you've enclosed that and you're just left with a small hole. So just put a pin in the small hole. Let's come back to that in a moment. Uh, if you're up on the boundary and you have some folds or areas where the mesh just looks kind of crappy in quality, but it's not necessarily in a critical area, the other thing you can do is just go to your sculpt tools, okay? Go to brushes and use something like the robust smooth tool, and you can just smooth this boundary out. Okay, so we're not changing really the shape of this, we're just smoothing out the triangles of this boundary. All right, so let's move on to actually putting a base on this model that we can 3D print. So what I would suggest is just go to your select tool, and then what you want to do is double click right on that blue boundary of the model. Okay, this is obviously unique to Mesh Mixer. It'll be different depending on the program, but let's click directly on that blue line. And you see when I do that, it selects the entire boundary going all the way around this model. Now, just to clarify what you're seeing here, an STL is just a three-dimensional object that's made up of a bunch of little triangles, right? So when you're actually clicking that boundary, really what you're trying to do is you're trying to click one of the very edge triangles of this border. And when I double click that again, you see that I get all of those edge triangles. All right. So the next step I would suggest you do is you probably want to smooth that boundary. Okay. So under your modify menu, anytime you make a selection, you're going to have this thing pop up. Go under modify and just say smooth boundary, or you can use the hotkey, which is just to push the B on your keyboard. All right, and when you do that, you notice how it has, smoothed out the triangles on those edges that were kind of rough, and it's just made this a more smooth outline. Okay, so when we accept that, we've still got this entire boundary selected. Now it's where you can go ahead and transform that. So while that is still selected, you've got the whole boundary selected, come up here and go to There we go. Under the deform menu, it's transform. I struggle finding it because I always use these hotkeys. I'll just punch T on the keyboard and this widget will come up. Now all you've got to do is just take this and extend it up. You know, what kind of base do you want? Do you want it angled like that? Do you want it more or less straight up and down like this? It's really up to you. It's however you want to do that. But, you know, go ahead and extend it way up. I like to look at it from the front as well so that I can make sure that this is going in a vertical direction as opposed to being slanted to one side. But just pull up a big generous base like this, accept that, and now we're closer, but we still don't have a three-dimensional watertight object, okay? Now go to Edit and Plane Cut, and this should take care of this. All right, so when I make a cut through here, think of this as you know, putting the base on your model. All right, so I've made a cut across here where I want that model to be. And you see how it encloses it, but right now it's actually discarding the part of the model I want to keep as opposed to the part I want to discard. If you'll hit this large arrow right here, it will flip that, and now you see that it closes in the top of that. All right, so next consideration is how big of a model do you want to print? Do you need this whole palette? If not, it's going to be a lot faster model to print and use up a lot less resin if you just pull this thing down to the part you are concerned about. Right, so we could print this model, okay? Or if you do want to include the entire palette, you know, let's scoot this up until we see that none of that palette is being cut out, all right? And then we can just accept that. And there's your model. Now there's a couple of errors in this intraoral scan, which is very, very common. You'll have little areas of missed mesh, and in that case you still need to repair that. Again, going back to this little hole that we had earlier. So as a last step, you always want to make sure that you go and check for any holes and repair them before printing this. So go to Analysis, Inspector, and that's just going to bring your attention to any holes that you see. And we could correct those by one clicking on them, right? And the software will just fill them in. Or we could just simply hit Auto Repair All, and now all of those are repaired, and you see that there's no errors in this mesh anywhere. All right. Now the only other thing I would maybe suggest you might want to learn just for printing basic models like this is that this model is going to eat up a lot of resin. You know, I would ballpark this to be probably 30 or 40 milliliters of resin, which is really unnecessary. We don't need this to be a completely solid model. So one of the things that will save a bunch of resin for you is actually hollowing this model. All right, so let's go to Edit, Hollow, and now you can see all of that little interior that you're seeing through the transparency, that's going to just be air now. Now the one thing about that is that if you hollow this but you don't have anywhere for that excess resin to escape, you can still end up wasting a lot of resin just by the liquid that's going to get stuck inside of here. So I always like to include a couple of drain holes. So you could just double click here, let's say on the heels of the model, and those are going to end up being drain holes so that that excess resin has a place to drain out and you're not going to waste a lot of resin. Now I've also got this set for a 2mm wall thickness, which I think is more than strong enough for virtually any kind of model. You could increase or decrease that. So if I only wanted to make this wall thickness be, say, 1mm, I could change this number to 1 and hit update. But for our purposes, this is going to be perfectly fine. So let's accept that. And now you see that we have a hollowed model, right? And you can actually see internal to this if I was to cut through it. So think of all of that resin that's in this hollowed area that you're going to be saving by doing that one little step. It's going to make it much more economical for you. All right, so that's basically it. This now would be ready to export. And so I would just save that as, you know, hollowed model with your patient's name. And now that's ready to print. and now you just simply drag that into your 3D printing software, orient this base to the build plate, and most of the printers are going to have some mechanism to tell you, is this printable? You know, are there overhangs or anything? I know the Sprint Ray that I primarily use, it will tell you if this will print without supports. And usually if you'll orient this flat base to the build plate, you probably won't have to use supports. But, you know, it'll tell you if it needs them. If you need supports, just tell it to add supports, and now you're ready to print that. So once you print this, you would have a completed model that you could use for whatever your purpose may be, making retainers on it, uh, you know, just a study model, whatever the case may be. This would be an easy solution to do that.